The earliest written record of people using cannabis, also known as marijuana, goes back to around 2727 BC in China. Back then, they saw it as something that could help with health issues. And the ancient Greeks and Romans also knew about cannabis, and in places like the Middle East, the use of cannabis spread across the Islamic Empire into North Africa. In the 16th century, cannabis made its way to the Western Hemisphere when Spaniards brought it to Chile, mainly for its use in making fiber. In North America, the Spanish introduced cannabis, which was mainly grown as hemp on many farms. During the early days of colonial times, hemp became an important crop for farmers. Hemp, along with tobacco, became a big crop that people exported long before the American Revolution. It all started in 1611, when a few plants were brought across the Atlantic by the first settlers of Jamestown, Virginia. In 1619, King James I ordered these American colonists in Jamestown to increase their efforts to help England. The Virginia Company, which governed Jamestown, told the landowners to grow and send 100 hemp plants to support England. Later on, the colonists grew hemp to help expand England's influence in the Americas. Cannabis farming played a big part in the early days of the United States. Even George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon as one of his main crops. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hemp was widely used for making rope and fabric in the United States. After cannabis made its way to New England in 1629, from then until after the Civil War, it became an absolutely vital crop in North America. It played a key role in both colonial times and the country's economic plans. In 1775, people started growing hemp in Kentucky, and big hemp farms popped up in Mississippi, Georgia, California, South Carolina, and Nebraska throughout the 1800s. Cannabis was also used for medicine, and by the 1850s, it was available in American pharmacies after being introduced to Western medicine by William O'Shaughnessy in 1839. He specialized in herbs and taught his fellow Western doctors how to ease muscle spasms and pain via cannabis. People also used it to help with migraines and sleep problems, and it was a common pain reliever until aspirin was invented years later. During this time, there were efforts to control the sale of medicines, and laws were made in different states to regulate cannabis. These laws aimed to stop drugs from being mislabeled, mixed with undisclosed narcotics, or sold improperly, especially if they were harmful. Some laws required labels on drug packages to warn about their dangers, or they only allowed them to be sold in licensed pharmacies with a doctor's prescription. These laws also often prevented selling medicines to minors and limited how many times a prescription could be refilled. In a bulletin from the United States Department of Agriculture from around this time, it was noted that 29 states had laws related to cannabis. Some states, like Wisconsin and Louisiana, required a doctor's prescription for cannabis sales, while others did not list restricted drugs, but required labeling, including Nebraska and New York. In New York, the law originally listed cannabis as a poison, passed in 1860 after several suicides reportedly involving substances later classified as poisons. The initial version of the law prohibited the sale of cannabis without a doctor's written order, but the final version allowed sales without a prescription as long as the purpose and the buyer's details were recorded. However, all packaging had to bear the label poison in uppercase red letters. Even in states where cannabis was not included in poison laws, there were efforts to regulate it. In California, a bill introduced in 1880 aimed to regulate the sale of opium and other narcotic poisons, including preparations made from hemp. While this bill was withdrawn in favor of one focused solely on opium, subsequent bills addressing hemp-based drugs were introduced before the turn of the century. Between California and the Mississippi River, though, all bets were off, as the lawlessness in many territories and soon-to-be states meant local governments had not one iota of a decree or order banning the growth and consumption of cannabis. Historians explain that cannabis is a plant that spreads its pollen through the wind and grows well in areas where humans have made changes to the environment, like fields cleared of trees or brush. The perfect description for the American frontier in the mid to late 19th century. Because it was widely available in the western United States by this time period, cannabis became a popular substitute for tobacco. This was widely true where tobacco wasn't as easily accessible, again, in Western territories. It was also cheaper and could be found on the side of the road, depending on where one traveled. Cannabis flourishing across the Wild West was also the first time the plant was widely consumed purely for its psychoactive effects. In other words, it stopped being used as a medicine and quickly turned into a recreational substance. Enter the Cannabis Cowboys. During the 19th century, as irrigation projects changed the landscape of the western United States, Mexican workers introduced cannabis to areas in the west and north. And after the Mexican-American War, the newly unionized Texas held the biggest population of displaced Mexican people, as well as becoming the hotspot for those looking to flee the growing imperial vice grip squeezing Mexico as a country. As a result, Texas was by and large the first frontier locale to see an uptick in recreational cannabis consumption. This newfound recreation was by and large contained within working-class circles, specifically Mexican laborers. These groups included cowboys, who were predominantly African American and Mexican men at that point in time. Cannabis didn't take off like you might think, however. It was still a relatively unknown substance to a majority of settlers on the frontier, as other narcotics and medicinal opiates, not to mention alcohol, were the ingestibles of choice. Cannabis also arrived across the border with a new name, marijuana, the anglicized Spanish word for reefer. The recreational use of cannabis began to emerge in the early 20th century, introduced to the US by Mexicans fleeing the dictatorship of President Porfirio Diaz. In fact, one of the most well-known cannabis cowboys in history played a critical part in the Mexican Revolution. Francisco Pancho Villa, the outlaw turned hero, and the Robin Hood of Mexico, was also a stoner and pot connoisseur. Pancho Villa is celebrated for his military prowess, but his personal life remains largely shrouded in mystery. Much of what we know about him comes from oral traditions in Mexico, where his legendary exploits are passed down through folk songs called corridos. These songs paint him not only as a skilled fighter, but also as someone who knew how to enjoy life to the fullest, along with an obsession with cannabis. During the Mexican Revolution, Villa's escapades were immortalized in 4 popular battle hymns, including Adelita and La Cucaracha. While Adelita tells a tale of tragic love, La Cucaracha became Villa's anthem, detailing his triumphs, struggles, and wild lifestyle during the revolution. La Cucaracha notably glorifies marijuana, which was a common indulgence among Villa's troops during the conflict. It's believed that around half of Villa's army, including many Yaqui natives, regularly used marijuana, sometimes even before battles, believing it gave them strength and courage. In addition to marijuana, Villa's troops often indulged in mezcal and sotol, alcoholic beverages made from desert plants. Villa himself was known for his extravagant lifestyle, earning him a reputation as a charismatic leader who knew how to have a good time. Despite his penchant for partying, Villa was also a formidable military strategist, leading successful operations even with poorly equipped and untrained troops. His followers, known as Villistas, remained inspired by his leadership, even during challenging times when supplies were scarce. Born Doroteo Arango, Villa's early life was marked by poverty and hardship. He rose to prominence as an outlaw and bandit, becoming a folk hero among the poor farmers he often aided with his raids on wealthy haciendas. While Villa was notorious for his romantic escapades including multiple marriages and relationships, his life took a more revolutionary turn in 1909. The death of his daughter, coupled with mistreatment by a wealthy landowner, ignited Villa's desire for social justice, leading him to join the revolutionary cause. Pancho Villa initially joined the revolution for selfish reasons. During that time, Mexico was rife with various revolutionary groups, and Villa saw an opportunity for profit through looting, plundering, and violence as part of the Revolutionary Army. However, his encounter with the prominent revolutionary leader, Francisco Madero, changed his perspective. Madero's strong ideals about land reform and social justice deeply resonated with Villa, despite his limited understanding of the political intricacies involved. From then on, Villa pledged his loyalty to Madero and the revolution, despite occasional outbursts of temper. Villa faced numerous challenges during his revolutionary journey. He narrowly escaped death sentences on multiple occasions, thanks to last-minute reprieves from Madero. And despite his devotion, Villa spent 4 months in a Mexico City jail before making a daring escape on Mexican Independence Day. Fleeing to El Paso, he quickly regrouped and formed a new army in Chihuahua City. After a fierce battle, his forces captured Juarez, and Villa assumed control of the city, implementing various reforms and enjoying a lavish lifestyle funded by taxes and legalized vices like gambling and prostitution. During his rule in Juarez, Villa lived extravagantly, using hidden treasures to fund his army and indulge in luxuries like fancy cars and unlimited cannabis. He gained widespread acclaim as Madero's top general and even returned control of Chihuahua City to the people as a Christmas gift. Despite his military triumphs, Villa's fortunes took a downturn when his old rival Carranza rose to power, backed by the United States. Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico, prompted a punitive expedition led by General Blackjack Pershing. Though Pershing failed to capture Villa, the pursuit strained his resources and led to a decline in his influence. In his last bid for glory, Villa launched an assault on Juarez, but was defeated due to his troops' stoned drunkenness. He retired to a ranch, but was assassinated in 1923, ending the life of a complex and controversial figure whose legacy continues to be debated. What's not up for debate is the impact Pancho Villa and his fellow Mexican contingents' cannabis craze had on the consumption of cannabis around the rest of the American West. The United States was developing rapidly at the quarter turn of the century, and the lawlessness of the open frontier was giving way to organized local governments. The heyday of the Wild West was over, and so was the acceptance of cannabis. As cannabis gained popularity in the United States, it became associated with negative stereotypes against Mexicans. And in the 19th century, newspapers and medical journals mainly referred to the plant as cannabis. However, in the early 20th century, the term marijuana became more common, partly due to anti-cannabis groups aiming to emphasize its Mexican origins and fuel anti-immigrant sentiments. The criminalization of cannabis is often attributed to various influential groups with economic interests in suppressing hemp production. They spread stories linking cannabis to violent behavior, particularly among Mexican immigrants. This fear-mongering, coupled with existing prejudices, led to state-level restrictions and eventually federal prohibition. In 1937, Harry Anslinger, the U.S. Narcotics Commissioner, testified before Congress, presenting racially charged anecdotes to support marijuana prohibition. Similar sentiments were expressed by others, including Henry J. Finger, a member of California's State Board of Pharmacy, who voiced concerns about the drug's popularity among immigrants. While anti-cannabis sentiment had racial undertones, the narratives that cannabis was outlawed solely because of Mexicans is complicated. Mexico had already prohibited marijuana in 1920, years before the US federal government's crackdown. The concern stemmed not only from racial biases, but also from genuine fears about the drug's effects. Historical accounts suggest that before the 1900s, cannabis was primarily discussed for its medical and industrial uses. However, by the early 20th century, sensationalized news stories, like one from the Los Angeles Times in 1905, portrayed marijuana as a dangerous substance linked to violent behavior and mental deterioration. The perception of marijuana drastically changed during this time. However, there's limited information about its actual usage and effects, especially in terms of dosage, consumption methods, and potential combinations with other substances. The experience of smoking a joint mixed with tobacco would differ greatly from consuming cannabis-infused food or drink. By 1936, every state had prohibited the recreational use of cannabis. The federal government further solidified this ban with the introduction of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937. Despite these laws, cannabis continued to be used illicitly until the 1960s. During the 1960s, cannabis gained widespread popularity yet again, especially among young people and the hippie counterculture. It became a common sight at protests against the Vietnam War. However, it remained illegal for any purpose. In 1970, the use of cannabis was officially banned for all purposes with the passing of the Controlled Substances Act. This legislation came after the Supreme Court invalidated the Marijuana Tax Act in 1969, ruling in the case Leary v. United States. In the Wild West, cannabis played a multifaceted role, evolving from a medicinal plant used by immigrant laborers to a recreational substance associated with outlaws and cowboys. Its journey through the frontier reflects broader societal shifts, from acceptance to prohibition and back again. Despite being outlawed for much of the 20th century, 24 states have since rescinded their bans on cannabis, with another 14 legalizing cannabis for medicinal purposes only. However, weed in the United States is still nothing like it was back in the late 19th century. As we continue to navigate the complex landscape of cannabis regulation and perception, its history in the Wild West serves as a reminder of its enduring cultural significance and its ability to shape and be shaped by the societies in which it is found.